A very warm welcome to this special seminar, War in Ukraine, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives, hosted by the Centre for the Study of War, Media and Society in the School of History at the University of Kent. Before I get started properly, I just want to draw your attention to a couple of things to do with the Centre. We have a new series of blog posts coming up that will begin today and continue over the next couple of weeks on war, media in the Middle East, which is edited by a former PhD student from the Centre, Anne Caldwell, now at the University of Nottingham. And her opening post, her introduction to this short series that goes live today, actually reflects on some of the comparisons between the way the Middle East has been portrayed historically and the way that the war in Ukraine is being portrayed today. The other thing I should say is that a page of links with further reading relating to some of the things that will be discussed today will be made available. I will put a link to that in the chat, and it'll also be circulated with the recording of this session. So you have access to further reading, both written by or created by some of the panelists, and also some other material, including ways which you can contribute or give money to the cause of those in Ukraine. A brief introduction from me. My name is Dr. Charlie Hall. I'm a lecturer in modern European history at Kent, and I've been very graciously invited to chair this panel. Now, there's a sort of different tone to this to many of the academic events that we hold at Kent, in that we're talking about issues that we're watching unfold in real time, and I think we're balancing our desire to understand what's going on and to offer some understanding on that, with also our sympathy and consideration for those who are living through it. And I think we should bear that in mind in the discussion that we have today, and balance our interest in the subject with sensitivity to those who are experiencing it first or even second hand. So please do bear that in mind when we get to the stage of question and answer. I should also say that although the recording has now begun, the recording will continue for the panel discussion, but we'll then terminate the recording before we move to the question and answer in order to allow a kind of slightly freer discussion. So a few kind of introductory remarks then. I think one of the reasons that the war in Ukraine has dominated headlines and triggered such a potent reaction across the world is that in many ways it challenges our fundamental understanding of what modern Europe should look like. The rhetoric from across the kind of political mainstream in recent years has been one of confidence that Europe will remain peaceful and stable despite its many challenges, and that has been the case in the eyes of some since 1945. Even if that does require a kind of selective memory to choose to forget certain other conflicts, such as that in the former Yugoslavia and in Cyprus that have taken place in that time. The unprovoked invasion of a sovereign state by a larger military power, led by a kind of, in many ways, old-fashioned strongman leader, evokes memories of the interwar period and the outbreak of the Second World War, which has been inflamed, I think, even further by rhetoric from many sides about Nazis and about appeasement. Those kind of historical parallels are being drawn in different ways. But the historical significance of the present crisis stretches back much further, I think rooted in the geographical significance of the region and long-standing disputes over national identity, as evidenced, I think, perhaps most notably by Putin's demonstrably false claim that Ukraine is Russian and has no native identity or culture, something that I hope we'll have a chance to talk about later. Nevertheless, despite this long-form historical significance, this is a conflict of the 21st century, one that may have echoes of the Cold War in its animosity between East and West, but with new dimensions as well. NATO's role in Europe has changed undoubtedly since 1991, yet Putin has still cited its proximity to Russia's borders as justification for his actions, obviously in a very problematic sense. Moreover, Ukraine understandably looks to NATO to offer backing in various forms against the aggression that they're facing. So we can see that role of NATO again, something we'll hear about later on. Moreover, the way the war is being fought raises troubling questions. Tank columns and the aerial bombardment of cities are time-worn features of European conflict over the last 100 years or so. But there is also an information war being fought in parallel in the online space. Only last week, Ukraine's digital minister said Twitter is part of their war effort. So this, in a sense, is a blending of old and new in the way that the war is being fought. I think you've all heard quite enough from me. So while these are ideas and notions which I'm sure members of the panel will address in greater depth, I'd like to give a brief introduction to our speakers. I think it is a real testament to the diversity and the interconnection of strengths within the School of History at Kent that 6 colleagues from very different backgrounds, very different specialisms, have all come together to offer their unique perspectives on this one issue. And we're going to proceed in a roughly kind of chronological order, sort of build up from the furthest back we can to a very contemporary angle. So we'll begin with Dr. Suzanna Ivanic on the origins of Ukraine. Then we'll hear from Dr. Peter Good with the view from the Middle East. Then we'll hear from Dr. Philip Boobbyer, interpreting Putin and Russia. Then Dr. Aurélie Basha, who'll talk to us about the role of NATO. And then finally, we'll hear from Professor Mark Connelly, our head of school, and Dr. Timothy Bowman, who between them will give us some reflections from military history. So I think we can see there the diversity of opinions that we'll hear, and the fact that we should end up with a complex and well-rounded understanding of the crisis in historical perspective. So without further ado, I will hand over to Suzanna.
Thanks very much, Charlie. And yeah, I want to start with something you already touched upon. On 12th of July 2021, Vladimir Putin published an essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And in it, he painted this broad picture to create a narrative of a shared history and identity of peoples in Ukraine and Russia. And he references the medieval empire of Rus and puts forward a united sense of identity and community. And again, in his 21st of February speech, just under 3 weeks ago, Putin claims that Ukraine is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. And he continues, since time immemorial, the people living in the southwest of what has historically been Russian land have called themselves Russians and Orthodox Christians. And these references are to the pre-modern era prior to nation states, when Europe was filled with vast kingdoms, very loosely held together. Kievan Rus from the 9th century to the 13th century extended from the Black Sea, down here, up to the Baltic and the White Sea in the north. And as the name implied, in the city of Kiev was the center, while Moscow at the time is something akin to a village. The kingdom and the southern part of it especially held a very particular role in terms of bringing Christianity to Europe. So Ukraine is down here, of course. In 988, Christianity was adopted from the Byzantine Empire, which lay to the south. So here's an image of the Byzantine Empire in the 11th century. And this is Crimea, so Ukraine lies just up to here. And here is Constantinople, the center of Eastern Christianity, modern-day Istanbul. And Byzantine fashions and artistic styles are adopted in Kievan Rus. Here's a pendant that is held in the Met Museum, which you can see that gold and enameling that's very reminiscent of Byzantine fashions, and it's found in Kiev. So with such a massive territory in this medieval period, there are many encroachments on Kievan Rus, fracturing and claims to land from neighboring powers, particularly from around the 12th century. And in the 13th to 15th centuries, the Mongol Golden Horde made incursions, sacking Kiev in 1240. And the rise of Russia came with power being transferred or taken from Kiev away up into the north east to Vladimir Suzdal, and then to Moscow, eventually kind of allowing Moscow to create this power base in the 14th century. And Muscovy itself then aligns itself with the east. And this is what allows British explorers there in the 16th century to comment that they were discovering new territory. So it's so sort of exotic and different in Moscow in the 16th century. However, Kiev at this time realigns itself with the West, or with what is Eastern Europe. So it makes relations with the territories to the west, what is Poland and Lithuania in the 14th century, and Hungary. And it continues to have those close associations with the Byzantine Empire to the south, as well as adopting Renaissance influences. So one of the points here is, for example, when Constantinople falls to the Ottomans in 1453, Kiev, and especially the Pecheskaya Lavra monastery, becomes a center for icon production in the Byzantine tradition. So you can imagine those golden icons of religious figures. Also, Renaissance styles are adopted, particularly from the early 16th century until the mid 17th century, especially great examples in Lviv. Here you can see the arcades and the stucco, and all of these features that are very reminiscent of a sort of European Renaissance. In the 15th to 18th centuries, another territory, the Crimean Khanate, presides over some of the Ukrainian eastern territories, taking slaves from Christian populations in Ukraine and Poland and bringing them to the Ottoman Empire. And one of the most famous of these, thanks to Peter for flagging this up, is Roxolana, who is the wife of Sultan Suleiman the Great, painted here by Titian in about 1550, and she is from Ukraine. In the 17th to 18th centuries, the Zaporozhian host or Cossack hetmanate, a semi-military Orthodox Christian, ethnically and culturally distinct group, rules over central Ukraine. But they operate, of course, in conjunction with all these competing powers around it. Here's that famous painting from the 19th century of one of these treaties being thrashed out. Some of the important dates are 1569, the Union of Lublin, which is the formation of this massive Commonwealth, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to the north, that brings much of Ukraine within the Polish crown. In 1654, the Treaty of Pereyaslav, where the Zaporozhian hosts seek protection from Poland against Russia. So these interplays between these two, all these competing powers being thrashed out. And in 1667, the Treaty of Andrushovo, agreement here between Poland and Russia to divide Ukrainian territory between them. And in the late 17th to 18th centuries, autonomy was granted by Russia to the Cossacks, and this then eventually is replaced by direct control by Russia. So there's a kind of ebbing away of this, this power and autonomy. So in no way is this a simple story of badging the territory as united since time immemorial. And modern days, Russia's claim to the territory is a rewriting of this history, and much of its rich heritage and culture was established prior to those power grabs from the northeast. Putin's claim is always framed in the same way, that Russia is the power holder. Ukraine is only part of Russia. The people living in the southwest of what has historically been Russian land have called themselves Russians and Orthodox Christians. It's on the basis of this distortion that he justifies the war. So it may be possible, of course, in these maps to find labels of Russia, but this is a Ukrainian history and culture, and we need to remember this pre-modern era and to preserve the evidence for it. Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks very much, Suzanna. Yeah, absolutely fascinating and a really timely reminder. I think that when we talk about events taking place today, we need to look back beyond the last 100 or so years to really understand the complexities of kind of not just cultural and political identities, but what came through really strongly there, Suzanna, was the religious identity as well, and how much of a bearing that still has today. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate I should have said earlier that we're trying to limit where possible each panelist's to about 6 or so minutes. Suzanna, you did some excellent timekeeping there, but just for those yet to come, I will be, if you see my hand go up, that means you've got kind of a minute left, so please wrap up. So with that harsh warning, Peter, would you like to pick up with the view from the Middle East?
Thanks very much, Charlie, and thank you, Suzanna. I'm actually probably going to run a little bit under 6 minutes for the simple reason that Suzanna has covered part of what I was going to say. The first thing to say is that for the Middle East, the Ukraine and Russia in the north is a very important part of the worldview of the region. And I'm going to look at this from three different perspectives, more modern perspectives. The first, Turkey, the second, Syria, and then the third, Iran. So to start with a brief history, the Crimean Khanate, so the Khanate of the Crimean Peninsula, an ally of the Ottoman Empire, was only actually annexed by Russia in 1783 officially. And then, of course, we famously have the Crimean War, where Britain, France, and of course the mighty power of Piedmont intervene on the behalf of the Ottoman Turks to protect Turkey from the encroachment, or the Ottoman Empire as it was then, from the encroachment of Imperial Russia to some success. But to move us much further forward, the first thing that I noticed when the conflict the invasion of Ukraine started was a renewed and sudden interest in the 1935 Montreux Convention. And this is a convention which was signed by the various imperial great powers in 1935, governing and controlling the straits of the Golden Horn, the Sea of Marmara, so the straits that run between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, over which Turkey holds pretty much unilateral control. The most important part of this, first of all, is that it limits the transit of warships between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and this counts in peacetime for powers that are not Black Sea powers, so not nations with a coastline on the Black Sea. However, Turkey is permitted to decide in times of war, and again the Turkish government can decide what they believe to be a time of war is, to limit the transit of ships from any power. And very tellingly, the Turkish Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu has already declared that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a war, that it gives lie, at least from the view of Turkey, to the idea that the Russians are undertaking a special military operation, or whatever euphemism one chooses to use for it. The Turks have taken a very clear stand on their view that this is a war, this is a conflict. And indeed, the Turks have actually already limited the transit of 4 Russian warships and 1 submarine through the straits on the pretext that this does not fit within the bounds of the convention. So the Turks have taken an interesting stand in some ways. Their previous relationship with Russia having been relatively good, although Turkey is a member of NATO. They are also, the relationship between the two has been deteriorating relatively rapidly over my second case, which is Syria. In the first instance, both Turkey and Russia basically chose different sides in the Syrian civil war, resulting in fact in Turkey limiting the transit of or the use of its airspace to Russian military jets. And this resulted actually in 2015 of the destruction of a Russian jet over Turkey when it violated their airspace, although again, according to the Russians, this was an aggressive act by the Turks and not otherwise. So for Turkey, Turkey currently sees itself in a complex position where it is a member of NATO with control over a vital shipping lane for which the Russians are demanding ever greater use, while also on the opposite side, in many ways, of the civil war, the ongoing, and I should add it, an ongoing civil war in Syria, and all the while essentially trying to balance the power that it has through the Montreux Convention. The last thing, of course, to notice is the Turkish supply of military hardware to Ukraine over the last 8 years rather, since 2014. And these most famously now have included the sale of the Bayraktar TB2 drones to Ukraine. So effective indeed have these Turkish-made drones been that Ukrainians have now written a folk song about them. If you haven't heard it yet, it's available on YouTube. So the view from Turkey is one of balanced instability in many ways. What happens in Ukraine, what happens with Russia, and Russia's pretenses to regional supremacy in the Black Sea are of immediate concern. However, we'll move on now to Syria, and the view from Syria is very different. As I say, the civil war in Syria is ongoing in many ways, although government control has been at least patchily reformed, I suppose, over a large part of the country. In 2017, Vladimir Putin announced that Russian troops would remain permanently in Syria as a garrison over the Mediterranean port of Tartus, as well as various air bases. Various human rights organizations have already mentioned that the Russian intervention in Syria has killed more civilians than either Jabhat al-Nusra, the Nusra Front, the Syrian regime itself, or indeed Daesh or ISIS. So in Syria, we also already see that Russia is very much the guarantor of the Assad regime's stability, and what happens in Ukraine will make a significant difference, or rather Russia's considered power in Ukraine, or lack thereof, will have an immediate and direct effect on the stability of the Syrian regime.
I'm very sorry, Peter. I hate to interrupt you, but that is your almost 7 minutes there, I'm afraid.
Oh, wow.
So I don't know if you want to say very briefly about Iran before we close.
I apologise. Yes, I will do. So the first thing to say about Iran is that in a period after the Trump presidency, Russia is still part of the JCPOA, the Joint Convention on the Proliferation of Nuclear Arms, and Iran's again own pretensions as a regional power, and this has a direct impact that Russia is one of the guarantors of this international treaty, and in fact today we've just seen the release of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and another former prisoner of the Iranian regime, which signifies something of a thawing of relations. The last and most important thing that I will say from a human perspective is that Russia and Ukraine both represent the largest suppliers of food to the region of the Middle East at a time when civil war, massive issues of massive refugee crises, particularly in Lebanon, have caused food prices to skyrocket. And for example, Turkey makes 70% of all of the flour that is produced in the Middle East, and therefore the ongoing instability in Ukraine and with Russia, as well as the sanctions regimes, may bite into the pocket of Western consumers somewhat, but in comparison to the potential dangers of widespread widespread issues of food availability in the Middle East, this appears as nothing. So I will leave it there, and I shall pass on. Thanks very much, Charlie, for your very kind forbearance.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, I mean, a fascinating perspective that I think reminds us how important it is to see these things with a wide-angle lens, and particularly, I think your final point there about food shortages remind us that it's not a case. We see a lot of comparisons. People saying, "Well, now we're talking about Ukraine. Why weren't we talking this way about the conflict in Syria or in Yemen?" But actually, it's more complicated than that. It's a case of how do these conflicts impact on one another as well. So I think that was a timely reminder of that. Thank you. Okay, with no further ado, then I'll hand over to Dr. Philip Boobbyer to talk about interpreting Putin and Russia. Philip, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie, and hello, everybody. I'm going to offer some historical perspectives on two things, Putin and on Russian dissent. Now, firstly, on Putin. Putin once called the collapse of the Soviet Union a catastrophe and a tragedy. In spite of this, he's actually been very critical of Soviet communism. This was evident only a few weeks ago, when just before the invasion, he blamed Lenin and the Bolsheviks for creating Ukraine as it is today. One of his aims is to correct what he sees as mistakes in Soviet nationalities policy. Connected with this, he's been much influenced by Russian émigré thinkers who were strongly anti-communist and in favour of greater Russian nationalism. And of course, he sees Russia, Ukraine and Belarus as part of a larger community. We can thus see Putin as a kind of Russian empire builder with a pan-Slav ideology. But this does not offer a full picture. If Putin has doubts about the Soviet experiment, there's also much that is very Soviet about him. Politically, he has much in common with Lenin, especially when it comes to dealing with enemies. Exactly 100 years ago, Lenin forced many of his main intellectual opponents into exile. The huge Russian brain drain of today has much in common with those events. Another way in which Putin is close to Lenin, as well as to Trotsky and Stalin, is in his readiness to use violence and thuggery. One tactic these figures all promoted is what we could call hostage-taking. The founders of the USSR coerced people into obedience by threatening their relatives or communities and using brutality as a form of propaganda. Such tactics were used by Lenin and Trotsky in the Russian Civil War, by Stalin during the Terror, and later, more subtly, by KGB chief Yuri Andropov in the 1970s. Putin's early career was in the KGB, and he's been much shaped by that. A prominent critic of the Soviet system, Sergei Kovalev, once said that hostage-taking was the central mechanism of control in the Soviet system of power. This kind of bullying is today being deployed on a national as well as personal level. Moscow is constantly saying, implicitly or explicitly, if you don't give us what we want in Ukraine, then someone else will suffer. There are hints at the use of nuclear weapons, or as Peter has said, starvation in the Middle East. The combination of Russian and Soviet elements in Putin's outlook is one reason for his political success. Until 3 weeks ago, he presented himself as a reconciler of traditions. I see parallels here with Napoleon, who after he came to power in 1799 in France, presented himself as a force for stability. A reason for Putin's not wanting to call this war a war is surely that it undermines the image of patriotic pragmatism which he has so carefully cultivated. Now some words on Russian dissent. As we know, there are many Russians, particularly among the younger generation, opposed to the war. There's been a wave of protests and arrests. You perhaps know of the protest on Russian state TV a couple of days ago by journalist Marina Ovsyannikova. She held up a placard telling people that they were being lied to about the war. There is a tradition here. 54 years ago, following the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, there was a small protest on Moscow's Red Square. Just 8 people were involved, who were then arrested and subjected to a show trial. The question the protesters faced ahead of the demonstration was whether to demonstrate knowing that imprisonment would be the result and the immediate impact minimal. As part of her protest a couple of days ago, Marina Ovsyannikova released a statement apologizing for having been a Kremlin propagandist. She clearly wanted to overcome a feeling inside herself of being complicit in wrongdoing. Back in 1968, there was a similar motive at work. At her trial, one of the protesters, Larisa Bugaras, explained that if she'd not spoken out, she would have considered herself responsible for the invasion. As with Ovsyannikova, there was in her action a desire to overcome something in herself, an existential spiritual dimension, if you like. How to combat lies was a central theme of Russian dissident thought in the 1960s and 70s. And this is particularly evident in the work of novelist Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn saw violence and lies as having a symbiotic relationship. Violence can only be concealed by a lie, and the lie can only be maintained by violence, he declared. To me, that speaks into the combination of brutality and disinformation that is a key element in Putin's practice of power. Solzhenitsyn's call for people not to live by lies but to live in truth was, of course, taken up by figures like Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, and it became a key idea in the movement to overthrow communism in USSR and Eastern Europe. So, a key factor in current events is what is going on inside Russia. It's a conflict about what Russia stands for, and it's a conflict that in different ways has been going on for decades and centuries. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Philip. Absolutely fascinating, and I think the point you made there, the kind of symbiosis between violence and lies from Solzhenitsyn is one that struck me as well. The idea that we're watching something unfold where, in a post-truth age, if we buy into that term, which I remain skeptical of, but if we accept it at face value, the post-truth age, watching these things unfold through that kind of blurred lens, I think makes considering ways to respond to it all the more challenging. So that's particularly apt. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Philip. Let's move on now to hear from Dr. Aurélie Basha, who'll be talking about NATO. Aurélie, over to you.
Thanks, Charlie. I am really going to try to keep it to 6 minutes. There are a lot of things so I'm going to try to plant possible questions that could come out after so I can expand on them. I'll try to focus on really 3 points. I probably won't have time for the third, but I'll try. 2 points are about kind of NATO enlargement in particular, and the third is about kind of what I write about now, which is the 1960s, in particular parallels we might draw from the Cuban Missile Crisis. So first of all, on NATO enlargement, the first point I want to make is a kind of a point about the historiography of the early 1990s. It's not incidental, I think, that there's a very, very lively debate that's been going on for the last 2 years about what happened at the end of the Cold War, and particularly in the early 90s when kind of Russia-West relations were being reconfigured under Gorbachev and especially under Yeltsin. It's an exciting time for any student who wants to do graduate work on this to be getting stuck into these debates because documents are being declassified as we speak. And so we're having a much clearer sense of what considerations we're factoring in as NATO expanded. And really also a sense that none of this was inevitable. There are 2 books in particular that I think are worth your attention. Mary Sorotte's Not 1 Inch and Christina Spore's Red Square, Red Wall, which does something different because she compares to what happens in China. Sorotte's book in particular seems to have captured at least Sergei Lavrov's attention, and certainly we're hearing a lot. Her book is called Not 1 Inch. We even heard Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, use this terminology again. What they're referring to is a statement that James Baker, Secretary of State under George Herbert H.W. Bush, made about East Germany and concessions about whether or not NATO would move forward. What's remarkable about Sorotte's account is that you see how in that period agreements were made that were ambiguous, and they didn't actually. What they did more than anything was placate the different stakeholders that mattered at that moment, stakeholders that were internal to the US, alliance members in NATO, the Russians, Gorbachev, and then especially Yeltsin, and also Central and Eastern European countries whose own role in agency I think is sometimes understated, if not ignored in a lot of accounts. Until now and until the recent events, I'd read that book and I read those stories as ultimately, as a historian of bureaucracy, as a competition between battles kind of within the bureaucracy in the United States. And also to some extent, with those on the expansionist side winning out that battle, but also in some sense, also this idea that you had George H.W. Bush, who was the cautious one. I mean, I certainly remember the Dana Carvey SNL skit where he was prudent and everything, and that was handed over to a much more activist president that was Clinton. I think now I look at those things in light of the last couple of weeks in a very different lens, and I think I almost certainly Putin read something else, which is the reason why a lot of these dynamics were allowed to take off, was that Russia was an open door. And that actually there's a humiliating kind of story here where Yeltsin was drunk during key concessions, and particularly over Poland. In less than a decade, all Warsaw Pact members were either en route or had become NATO members. And in some respects, that was only possible because of Russian weakness. So that's the first point I want to make, and that's a kind of historiographical point in the book recommendation in some ways. The second point is more of a defense policy point, which is that I think we need to, what this crisis has exposed is some of the assumptions that underpinned NATO expansion, and that actually, again, were never made explicit. Programs like the Partnership for Peace and the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council in NATO that were created in the early 1990s, the assumptions behind those that so by which I mean the kind of founding members of NATO, would extend peace and security east, right? And peace, as we understood it, the lessons of the end of the Second World War that were then seemingly reaffirmed at the end of the Cold War, that interconnectedness, democracy, security sector reform, all of those things would bring peace and stability outwards. For many Central and Eastern European countries at the time, what they really wanted was the hard power reassurance of Article 5 and the kind of musketeer clause. Many of those countries feared, perhaps anticipated, that Russian expansionism would reemerge, and they wanted guarantees that NATO, and by default the United States, would protect them. The Iraq War came fresh off the heels of the Prague summit, where some of the biggest kind of expansion happened. And many of those countries leveraged their participation in the Iraq War and the fallout amongst Western allies to try to push NATO to set up more bases towards the east. There was even, at the time I was working there was a suggestion that the NATO headquarters could move from Brussels to Prague as the center of gravity of NATO had moved further east, which chimed with Rumsfeld's comment at the time that there was such thing as a new and old Europe. I can't help thinking today that instead of exporting, what we have done is we've imported 19th and 20th century threats. And we hadn't really considered what we're confronting today as a plausible risk when we kind of when NATO expansion happened. And I think in that sense, this crisis is far more serious than people think. Because I think part of what Putin is doing here is testing the waters about how serious we were about our Article 5 commitment to these new countries, and by extension, challenging the security infrastructure that really has kind of underpinned Euro-Atlantic security since the end of World War II. Now, Charlie, how many minutes do I have?
You have just about a minute left, Aurélie.
Okay, good. So good. A quick minute on the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, as a historian who now writes, because I used to write about some of these NATO issues, now I primarily focus on the 1960s, or I've thought a lot about the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's, I think, rightly heralded as an example of great leadership in a crisis. And I think there's something to that. I think there's a lesson there, though, about empathy, and that's very, very distinct from sympathy. Something there that we can maybe learn about providing even our adversaries a way out that allows them to save face. And I think much of the focus in the retelling of the Cuban Missile Crisis focuses on Kennedy, and there's something to that, right, and his steadfastness. And I think, unlike Biden, Kennedy never took off the table some of the biggest threats that Khrushchev would have to face if he didn't back down. But at the same time, and I think this is the real story of the Cuban Missile Crisis, behind closed doors, Robert Kennedy was meeting with Ambassador Dobrynin and in particular agreed to remove the Jupiter missiles, which in any case were useless militarily in Turkey, within 6 months, on the assurance that this would not be made public, that it was a quid pro quo. In any case, they denied it for 10 years, right? The Turks were furious. They saw this as a betrayal of alliance commitments. They were furious, and it soured relationships, but that was something that Kennedy understood in some ways was a price to pay to resolve this crisis. Now, I certainly hope, I mean, I think this is something that maybe we can think about all together, and Charlie, I'm sure you have a view on this, but I certainly hope that something like that is happening today and that we may not hear about it for decades, and I'm perfectly comfortable with that. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully I'm about it within the time.
Yeah, thanks, Aurélie. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that struck me there, you covered a sort of a wide range of things there, but you talk about NATO kind of underpinning the European and Atlantic security kind of structure roughly since the end of the Second World War, and yet actually how much ambiguity and how much kind of push there is, how much room there is to mold that, how much NATO's kind of actions or expected actions are dominated almost by wishful thinking on the part of some of its smaller, more recent members, that NATO will be there to back them up, whereas actually the ones who maybe hold the real strings of power in NATO have a much more cautious view of what NATO's role is. And I think the fact that we see it as this fixed constellation, when in reality there's quite a lot of wiggle room, I think is particularly interesting. Okay, and I think that segues very nicely onto our sort of final section, hearing from two speakers. Mark and Tim, have you sense of who would speak first?
I think perhaps we're going to do it a bit more as a dialogue. Are we, Tim, chucking some ideas between ourselves, and then, or do you want to lead off with?
I defer to my head of department on these.
No, or you lead off with a statement. That's fine by me. If that's what you want to do.
Why don't we, Mark, you open up, and then we'll see where it goes from there, and I'll give you a combined, combined 12 minutes.
Can I share a screen, share content?
You should be able to, Mark. Yeah.
Hang on. Share options. Why is it not? There we go. Can everybody see that? Lovely. Let's start the slideshow. So, there we go. Some perspectives from military history, and the idea is very much, certainly from my side, is that Tim to chuck in thoughts, and we can discuss these points between us. Well, I think the first thing that we can say that military history, certainly the military history of modern warfare, and particularly from the two world wars, has brought up, shows us many of the themes that we're discussing today about the nature of military operations in Ukraine. And the first and perhaps most important point is this thing about logistics, isn't it? I mean, the lorry trail, kind of outside Kyiv, you know, the number of transports that we've seen piled up there. And often, I think there's been in the media references to this grand old chestnut of military operations. The amateurs talk about tactics and professionals talk about logistics. And there we have a photograph of the so-called Voie Sacrée in 1917 snaking up to the Verdun front, which I think, you know, just really graphically, genuinely graphically captures something of the nature of modern war, which is the logistical nightmare that it creates. If you're going to have soldiers fighting, they burn through ammunition, they burn through rations and other materials, and you need an enormously complex machine behind them. Tim, do you want to come in on that point there?
Yes, I think the logistical element has been one of the most confusing of what we've been watching over the events in Ukraine. And this also, I think, ties in with the weather, that there is a sense you've ended up with this 40-mile-long armoured column essentially immobilised, because with the onset of spring and the thaw, you've ended up with lorries, tanks, armoured personnel carriers that are all essentially tied to metalled roads. So things that are designed to go off-road and to advance in a wide front have all been forced onto a very narrow metalled road surface. So this was not really predicted. I think if you're looking back to the grand planning of all this, it was presumably for a tank heavy sweep on a very wide front, but the whole lot has ended up tied down on the logistical front of what lorries can cope with. There's also been some talk, you've possibly seen the news, that a number of the Russian conscripts have been so demoralized that they have actually punched holes in the fuel tanks of lorries, which have then obviously run out of fuel and broken down and can be moved off the road, and that's essentially created a massive roadblock. This situation's changed in the past few days, but certainly for the first 10, 12 days of the campaign, the Russians seem to have lost control of the logistical grip.
Yeah, and it also seems, doesn't it, that Russian logistics, unlike perhaps many other forces now, are still heavily dependent upon heavy rail communications, taking stuff to rail heads and then shifting them from there. And you know, we know that in the Second World War, you know, what has become the kind of famed Nazi blitzkrieg of the early days of the campaign was in fact a sort of very flashy steel-edged tip on a rather rickety logistical train, which then fell apart in later operations in the war.
Yes, I mean, if you're looking at Great Patriotic War, I suppose is the phrase we should use, you do actually have a fair number of German units that are still land and horse transport, which of course has said that it's not quite as laughable as it sounds, because at least if all else failed, you could eat the horses. And beyond that, there was a sense that a number of the lorries and so on that were being used by the Germans 1941-42 were captured French vehicles that had been the French Army 1938-39. And I think, again, we're sort of into questions here. I can say a bit more about armour when we get to that, but there is a sense that a lot of the material here is fairly elderly stuff that may even go back to the Warsaw Pact days, that hasn't been particularly well maintained, and the consequences are rather inevitable.
Yeah, and of course, famously, Patton is going to say late on in the war, after the breakout from Normandy, my men can eat their belts, but my tanks got to have gas. That everything is flowing on petrol here. And I think didn't Winston Churchill say in 1918 that the Allies sort of floated to victory on a sea of petroleum, which the Germans were lacking, as they were going to lack again in 1945. So logistics is everything here, and I think that leads nicely in to what these guys, many of them young conscripts, are being dragged into, and that's if Vladimir Putin is prepared to pulp all of these cities, and we see urban warfare on a large scale. Well, we know from the two world wars, and particularly the Second World War, cities like Stalingrad or Caen, if you rubblize something to create a term like that, then it makes it so much easier for the defenders. For attackers, it's an absolute nightmare. And I think NATO still works on some of those Second World War scales, which is if you're going to smash a city from end to end, for every two defenders that are immobilized or neutralized, probably 5 of your attacking force are going to become casualties.
Yes, when I see this type of thing, I always think of Tom Wintringham's ideas. He commanded the British battalion of the International Brigade in the Spanish Civil War, so sort of saw the early stages of what's later called blitzkrieg, sort of armoured warfare. And what Wintringham said was that the solution, the answer to blitzkrieg, was to draw these armoured columns into street-by-street fighting. And of course, that's what we later see famously in Stalingrad. I suppose the other point to raise here is that, I suppose there's two you think of. The first is that tanks tend to be very heavily armoured at the front and sometimes at the back. If they can be attacked from the sides or from above with Molotov cocktails, then they can actually be very, very vulnerable. And the second bit to say is that in street-to-street fighting, professional soldiers don't have a massive advantage. Locals who know the area, know where particularly the underground system is or bunkers they can get to, are in a much stronger position than the professional soldier. So in some ways, this means that the professional elements of the Russian army don't have much of an edge over the essentially citizen militia that is largely defending Kyiv at the minute.
And of course, the deeper any attacking force, as was shown, particularly in the Second World War, gets into a large urban space. We've just been talking about logistics. The more strain that puts on the logistical arm, particularly if it feels that it's snaking its way through territory that it's never quite sure whether it's been pacified, whether they're holding it, whether they can move by day or by night. And certainly you're then back as well to those very strange ratios that armed forces have by 1945, which is what something like one frontline soldier to 8 or 9 in the logistical trail behind them, just to keep the operation rolling. And once you're bogged down in street by street fighting, as Tim just said, I think those sort of fine balances really begin to collapse, and the defenders, even if they're only loosely organised, find it easier to get their responses in. And there, back to your point, Tim, the vulnerabilities of armour and that huge, that continued discrepancy between the cost of the armoured machine and the relatively inexpensive weapon that's used against it. I mean, I know they've gone up in cost, but still compared with a tank, anti-tank rockets seem dirt cheap compared with a tank.
Yes, I was thinking about this last night when I was putting some ideas together, and the Armata tank, the T-14 tank, it was much vaunted when it was first released in 2015. That was being produced for $4 million was the estimate. I doubt the MOD in Britain could buy a lawnmower for that, given its pricing arrangements, but there we are, that's the figure there. Now, if some of the stories we have heard are true, some of these tanks have been taken out by drones that cost about £8,000. So that could be the really massive discrepancy here. The Russian army, from what you can work out, was based very much still on a sort of Warsaw Pact model, with the idea of heavy tanks being the key element behind it. But the production of this T-14 Armata tank hadn't gone entirely to plan. They'd originally planned to have 2,300 of them by the end of 2020, but it's clear that production rate wasn't met. So actually what's been put into action are largely T-72s and T-90s, so both thinking back very much to the Warsaw Pact period, and very heavy tanks. But it does appear that the Javelin missile, developed, of course, by Shorts in Belfast. You knew there was an Irish link coming in there somewhere. And the Stinger anti-tank missile, both remarkably cheap compared to actual tanks, have been very effective. But what the military historian doesn't know really is what happened to that column outside Kiev. Whether it simply bogged down, whether elements of it broke down, or whether it was action by Ukrainian forces with Stinger Javelin missiles that were taking out large numbers of them. That still isn't terribly clear at the minute. But certainly, it may be the time to say that the day of the main battle tank is over, if what we've seen is the case.
And I think that's our 10 minutes, is it, Charlie?
Yeah, I mean, if you have any concluding thoughts, you've got another minute or so. If there's anything you'd like to sort of say to wrap up, but if not, I'm happy to move it on.
Well, I think it's what I think is really interesting here as well. It is how perhaps historians and military historians and even generals can sometimes fall into the trap that cycles of history are closed, and it's back to sort of Aurélie's point about what do you prepare for, and there were lots of treatises, lots of books written in the 1990s that basically said it was unlikely that conventional armed forces of major states would go head to head against each other in any kind of scenario ever again, that makes me think. As historians, I'm much happier talking about things in the past, funnily enough, rather than predicting the future. Those kind of definite statements strikes me always come back to haunt the people that have made them.
The final thing I would say is that the British Army has made a lot of reconfiguring itself recently with the idea of yet more special forces, a new Ranger regiment. But what we can see from all this is that the Russian special forces that it was thought would give them a distinct edge at the start of the war seem to have been remarkably unsuccessful. It appears that 2 aircraft full of paratroopers were shot down in the early stages of the war, 500 dead from what we can make out. But otherwise, this seems very puzzling, because you would have thought that the ability for special forces to infiltrate behind the lines, where of course many in Ukraine are Russian speakers, and that shouldn't be too difficult to do, and cause dissension and direct people in the wrong directions, bung up refugee camps, whatever else, that would all in the face off would have been very easy to do. But this looks to be a remarkable failure of special forces as well as of heavy armour.
Wonderful. Thanks to both of you for that. I think the theme that struck me there, which I think has recurred perhaps throughout our short pieces from each of our panelists, is the idea that despite all the talk about novelty and innovation and kind of new developments, in reality what we're seeing is a surprising reprisal of age-old themes, whether that is the tank as a slow-moving and vulnerable piece of hardware, to broader questions about how large states mobilize for war and how effectively they can do that.